There she is. You are like last minute on all these.
I'm always going to like, well, the last 10 minutes when everyone's chatting about stuff, that's always about the most fun part. Yeah. And you're like,
There was water bottles, I thought.
no water for you, and someone's reading glasses. Well, we only have four. We only have four chairs.
I know.
I'm sorry. I'm going to pull up a chair. I'm going to pull up a chair.
They took it.
Maybe the day does matter. Remember how many people?
Yeah.
Should we sit at one big table?
Do you guys want to make this like
Make a
more
big
intimate
circle?
at a table? Let's do that.
We don't like.
Yeah. We're like deeply unscary.
The day. I know we were wondering like, is it going to be the day or the interest in the topic?
Apparently it's the day. Well, the day and the interest.
I tweet about this until we forgot. Oh, did I? Oh, did I?
Although I think we still need to use the mic because I think they're recording us.
Because they're recording it?
This is
No.
news to me, but most of the other ones that we've had, they said make sure you speak to the mic because we're recording it.
But they're not recording because there's no.
There's no actual people here.
Yeah. I think we're fine.
Recording
More
this
intimate
whole
for a
thing.
small group. It'll feel less
Hey, we're seeing
like
you again.
intimidating to ask a question.
You had so many good questions.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to listen to this, but I made a call by accident and I forgot that it's on New York time.
I don't know.
But I had to step out. Pain in the ass thinking of New York time in Texas. I did that something like this, so I almost forgot my tired day.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's what I. There's another where the legality of the job decision is on right now. It's like I actually.
That's right now.
There's always a conflict. All right, shall we get started?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well.
Yeah, so we're gonna pull the audience so that we know who's here. I'm Elizabeth. I do not have an R01, which is why I like leading this panel so that I can ask them all the questions that I have and learn about it. And maybe someday I will be sitting there, and one of you guys will be asking questions, or maybe you'll be sitting there and I'll still be asking you questions. I'm gonna have everyone introduce themselves, but just so we know who you guys are, is anyone a medical student? Resident? Fellow, faculty, and who has submitted what I guess what? Should we go around? Yeah. All right, we're going to start with you.
Hi, my name is Bory Kea. I'm an associate professor. I'm on my second year of my K, so I want to be fruitful in transition. So that's my.
Great.
I'm Karen, University of Iowa. I'm in the end of my first year of my research fellowship in an EM-PSTP program, and I'm working at submitting either a K99 R00 or a K08 here at Whiteford.
I'm Ryan. I'm a research coordinator at GW. My PI couldn't be here, so I'm trying to just soak in as much about the grant submission process as I can.
Can we ask who your PI is?
Andrew Meltzer.
I'm Laura Maloney. I'm at Stony Brook. I'm in EMS, and my other passion project is environmental engineering. I'm a co-I on an R25 that's ending in a couple months, and then moving up to a multi-beginner spot for a reasonable R25. So I'm learning the other alphabet soup things and thinking about other ways to reimagine, especially EMS and the engineering stuff, which I'm learning so much. The past couple of days and having some context to put it in is incredibly helpful, and it makes it a lot more believable. Kind of like this is much helpful. So this is awesome.
I'm Jimmy Trong. I'm one of the EM attendings at Columbia. I'm just here supporting more.
You're too kind. You're far too kind.
Awesome. I'm Megan Barry. I'm a second year global EM fellow at Brown. I'm staying on with some protected time to work on a K08 this fall, and I'm just here to try to absorb everything. So my understanding is like the minute you get the K08, you have to start working on the hopper.
My name is Miriam. I'm actually an undergraduate student, and
Very early. She's planning far in advance.
So in the next 15 years.
I'll be there.
Hi, my name is Roy Kim. I'm a research coordinator. I work with Dr. Bory Kea out of Jesse.
So I'm Marc Probst. I'm at Columbia University with Jimmy, and I had a K for several years, and then I made the transition to the R about 4 years ago. And now I'm thinking hard about the next grant.
I'm Bory Kea. I'm at OHSU. I was on a K-12 and then to a K-08, and starting my 3rd year of my R. And also still thinking about the next one already, because you get anxious after you even get it.
I'm Samuels-Kalow. I'm at MGH. I did the K-12 program with these guys and then transitioned to a KL2. I'm starting the 3rd year of my R01, and then also have a H3 from NIH will be my next grant, and then an R01 to NINR that's under review right now. Fingers crossed for that.
Amber Sabbatini, I'm at the University of Washington. I did a K-12 program, but not the emergency medicine one. I did a K-12 in patient-centered outcomes research that was funded by ARC. That was interdisciplinary. I was the only physician in that. My story is that I applied for a KOA and scored in the 7th percentile, and they did not fund it at ARC. And so I pushed it out for a year. And after a crisis, went for the R, and then got an R34 and an R01. And so, based on my mentor. And so I think that's a good segue, because one of the goals that we really want to convey in this session is that there's multiple pathways to this, that it's not as intimidating to go for our funding, that probably we're delaying applying for it longer than we need to be. And you're going to hear things like, well, what kind of experience or preliminary data and stuff do you actually need to be competitive for this, and when should you maybe choose that over a KO?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And actually, so that brings us to I think, one of our first questions that we're going to talk about. So my path is that I am in the 5th year of my K. I submitted an R01 and an R34, and I probably should have submitted it a little bit sooner. When I applied for my K, we had the question. I already had the research fellowship. I already had, however many publications. Should I have just gone for an R? And that was a big conversation. And then when I came and sat down with these guys the first time last year, I was like, well, maybe I should have just gone for the R. And you sort of, you never know in retrospect, but I think that's a great question. So I think that I'd love for people to interrupt with what questions are relevant for them. The planned sort of topics are basically experience that you guys think are needed, deciding on the R01 versus other Rs in the K, building your team, prelim data, choosing your question, dealing with rejection, budgeting and scope, clinical lie down, and what I wish I had known. So those are the things that we are planning on talking about, but if there's other things that we want you to interrupt and bring them up, because this is for all of you guys. So let's start with sort of the experience. How much experience do people need before they start applying for the R01 specifically, and how do people choose between R01s, R3s, R21s, and doing a K award instead?
Yeah, great question. So my mentors pushed me pretty hard in the K direction. So I never actually thought about going directly to the R. I think my understanding is that you do need to establish yourself as kind of a budding expert in a specific field with multiple publications, first author publications, to demonstrate to NIH that you know what you're doing and you can complete research. You can start projects and you can finish projects. And I think it's also key to surround yourself, especially when you're more junior, to surround yourself with other experienced NIH-funded investigators on your team. And the team is critical. Really, if you have any specific focus or element in the study, you should have an expert in that on the study team. So to give you an example, I submitted a grant in October, did not get a great score, but they actually loved the investigative team. I got dinged on like approach and other things like that, but the investigative team, it was a clinical trial looking at cardiac monitors and syncope, and I had a clinical trialist, electrophysiologist, biostatistician. I was doing cost effectiveness, so I had a cost effectiveness expert, and then I had 2 other syncope experts who were all on the grant. So every base was covered, and I think that's really important to have a big team with all the elements covered with experts who are funded in the area.
They weren't getting buy down though by being on the proposal though, right? Like, were you having to cost share?
Oh, great question. Yeah, great question. So that, I guess we could talk a little bit about co-investigators versus consultants. And yeah, it really depends on how much they're going to do. Some of them were on for 3%. You know, some of them were getting 10%. The bulk of it was actually coming to my effort, and then the consultants will get paid by the hour, whatever their rate is. I think it was $200 an hour for, you know, physician investigator, and that changes the finances a little bit. I don't know if we want to get into indirects and things of that nature, but typically people want a little bit of money to do the work, even if it's a small amount of work. But some people have so much funding that they don't really care if you give them 10% or 2% because it doesn't affect their, you know, their work-life balance or their clinical load.
But it is important to give them some effort to
Yeah.
show that there is investment in
Right.
that person too.
Because the study section is gonna, like now, I think many of us are now on study sections also reviewing these things, and they're gonna look at that and say, like, they're asking this person to do this much work, and they put them on for this much time, that looks inconsistent, something's wrong here. And people are gonna catch that if it's like glaring. You know, if you need them for 10% and you put them on for 8%, probably no one's gonna like really pay any attention to that. But if you expect them to do like 25% worth of work and you put them on for 2%, somebody's gonna catch that and say like, that doesn't look right. And if they're doing like substantial contributions to the methods and the analysis and you have them on as a consultant, you gotta have a really good explanation for why that's your structure for people not to be a little suspicious of that. So the R01 mostly has enough money that most of the people you need for this team, you're gonna be able to pay in a way that is consummate with the effort that they're putting in.
Did any of you, for your current R01s, consider R21s or smaller versions of your project, or how did you make those decisions if you did, or did you not?
Well, hold on, I don't actually think we answered the question on experience.
Mm.
So we went into
Oh,
budget
yeah.
and team.
Yeah. So pubs. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have that much to add, but yeah, I think you need several publications, first author pubs in a specific area that you propose to research to study, and I think it's helpful that you've gotten external funding as well prior to the R01, because it is a bit of a risk for NIH, right? It's like almost $5 million that they're going to send out to you and your institution, and they want to make sure they get a return on investment. So, I mean, I have heard some stories of people who never had funding before, submitted an R01 and got funded, but I think that's really the exception. That was you?
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
prior external funding?
Like
but you had,
tiny
right.
things.
But you
You
had
had
the
the
K-12.
K-12.
We had a K-12, that's definitely.
No, but I didn't. So a K-12 is like an application
Institutional grant.
internal,
Right.
it's not
But
an
it's still
external
funded.
grant, so.
believe we do great.
Well, okay, so I think this is really important. So, because I felt way too junior to be applying for an R01. So my mentor is very senior, and he said, you know what, you have preliminary data, you should just go for it. And actually the preliminary data, we'll talk about that, was like, not exactly the thing either. It was like similar, but not exactly the same. And so that's a very interesting comment on like what our perspective of preliminary data has to be. But I had 18 publications when I got funded for my R. So, like there were like a New England Journal and other stuff in that. So that helped, but I did get dinged on the team for being a junior PI. However, it was like a small ding. So they downgraded me to like a 2 on the application because unlike a K award where they rate the candidate, they are rating the team. And so I followed a strategy that my mentor does in his grants where he actually has a team section. And you basically explicitly say how everybody fits into the team model in that section, what their publications are, and what expertise they're bringing. Like you basically spell it out. Like you don't try to have the reviewers infer it from their like letter of support and their bio sketches. You write it in there, show how everybody integrates, and it starts off with, our team collectively has decades of experience answering these questions. And you did that on your R34 application. It's a really effective strategy because it takes the perspective off you, which was like the weak link for me, and puts it on, we're going to be doing this together. And so then your next step is to convince the reviewers that that team is actually going to work well together and is invested. And so that gets back at your comment yesterday a little bit. And so there's different ways you can show that, but even if like these two people have collaborated and these two, you know what I mean? And so I had mostly collaborated, so there were 3 of us of our team of 6 that had had 3 publications together that we laid out as our like background and preliminary work that were already published, and so we felt like we could make an argument that our team has been working together for the last 5 years.
It sounds to me like you're saying that you can make up for some of the like lack of the 5-year K with the team. Because it's team sport, it's not solely individually about you.
And also publications in high impact journals.
Yeah.
Lends more credibility to you as an investigator, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was like, you know, you still have to have, you can't just like go in totally green.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was surprising to me that that actually wasn't, what I thought was going to be the weaknesses in my application were not the weaknesses.
Right.
So, which I thought was me, so.
I will say for preliminary data, I agree. Mine was definitely not, I hadn't done a clinical trial in the field that I'm doing it in now, but my program officer said, you have data related to it, and everyone was saying, it's like, it's still good data, it's been published, just go for it, and that happened to work for me. We'll say that's different for everybody, though. It depends on, talking to your program officer before you submit is also very helpful. They can help guide you on what is of interest to that institute that you're asking money for.
So if you take one thing away from this conversation, that is probably the most important thing. Because I feel like when I was applying, I was like, program officer doesn't want to talk to me, right? I'm just some like junior person, like I don't know any of them. This is some like old boys network and they're all talking to each other. But actually they have like critically important information that is not written in the funding opportunity announcement, is not on the website, and the only way you're going to find out is by talking to the person. And so you send them a brief email requesting a half-an-hour meeting and including your specific aim page, and it is like gold. Because you will discover all kinds of useful information. First of all, they'll help you understand if your AIMS page is of interest to them, which is like super important to find out, because otherwise you're not going to send your application to that institute. But second of all, there's often some kind of like backdrop to what they're looking for that may not be written in the funding opportunity announcement. And this was brought home to us like really profoundly in our most recent submission. So we were submitting to NINR, which is National Institute of Nursing Research. We had written this really nice health services research grant with like health services outcomes. And we sent it to them, and they were like, well, obviously for this funding announcement, we're not funding anything without clinical outcomes. And we were like, obviously what? Like, it's not written in the thing, it's not written on your website, like, how are we supposed to know that? And we would have sent this completely non-responsive grant in and wasted a ton of time, and instead we just switched, like, our secondary and primary outcomes and, like, sent it off to them. You know what I mean? And it was, like, a life-changing half-hour conversation. And they're almost always willing to take these meetings if you do it a couple months before the grant is due, and it's so worth it.
Well, what are you specifically reaching out to?
So at the bottom, so
in that sort of scenario.
Yeah, so it depends on the type of grant you're applying for. So if you're applying to a specific RFA, so which this NIH R01 was, there is a program of like officials is like attached to that, and their name and email address is like at the bottom, and so you can find them. And so that those are easy. If you're applying to a parent R01, then it's a little bit harder to figure out who the right person is who manages your type of grant. If you've had a K in that area, your K program officer can often help, and sometimes they even are that person, which is like super convenient. If you, like, Mark has a much more linear research trajectory than I do, so he has like sort of the same person all the way up. I'm a little bit more scattered, and so have many different people that I work with. But if you write to a program officer, they're in that area or in that office, they can often help you find the right person. And so I usually start it with like, this is who I am. I'm looking to talk to someone about this type of grant. If you're not the right person, can you help me find blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And your mentor may also be able to help you with that as well. But their email addresses are on the parent RFA.
And I believe that, so NIH is aware that they have a lot of different POs and that sometimes it's unclear which one you should reach out to. I think they created an online tool, like a PO matchmaking tool. Yeah, I haven't actually used it in a long time, but I think it's still up and running. So you can actually put in some keywords, like for me, I might write like syncope, clinical trial, and things like that, and they can match you up or give you a list of people who might be relevant.
And within a given institute, you can also search, like on the website, they have all the POs listed, and so you can look to see like, NICHD, and then I want to do like critical illness, and it like links to Cinnamon Dixon or whatever,
Right.
And I've definitely had variability in how helpful POs are. So specifically the one for the K award for ARC was like,
Maybe it's the same one as mine.
yeah, everybody, like not helpful, doesn't weigh in on the idea, probably because ARC can't actually say anything about their priorities. They're like so sporadically funded. So, but also my NIA PO was like so standoffish. So we basically sent an email saying like, we're thinking about this idea to someone much higher up in the institute, and they're like, yes, we're interested in that idea generally. A few sentences back, you should schedule a meeting. We scheduled a meeting with the right PO, and he was like, yeah, okay, cool. You know, and just was like not helpful, not responsive. The grant hit funding line, it got funded, right? So like, so again, but then when I sent a grant to NIMH, who doesn't do pay lines, so then it gets this like nebulous score that seems good, but nobody's telling you anything. They're like, okay. So I sort of hear, so what they had is 3 levels of review before the council, where this PO had to present the grant to their, immediate director. And then if it passes, their questions come back, you answer questions from that person. And then it goes to the next level. And so it became very clear that it was going to be funded by the council when it made these levels, but it also became very clear that if Agnes, who's now retired, hadn't been enthusiastic about that grant, like that would have never made it through.
Right.
So you 100% have to talk to them. I've had 2 experiences where I went to a PO and they said, this is not the right place for you. And so like if I had not pivoted, like there would have been a lot of waste of time. So
Do you guys understand how it works? I mean, we need to go back to like more basic level of like the sections and then council.
That'd be a good assumption. Yeah, tell us.
Like study section.
Yeah.
Right.
So NIH is organized at the institutes, right? So there's like cancer and kids and dentists and audiologists and whatever. And there isn't one for emergency medicine. So most of us will find like a disease model system, or you can go to ARC if you do like straight up health services research, but they don't have as much money. So many people will try and find some disease model system to work within. If you're submitting a K, you'll go to a K study section within that institute. So IRBK is for like NIMHD, they're focused on minority health and health disparities, but all the Ks go to that study section. But if you're submitting an R, then you go to a study section that's based around an area of expertise. So you'll go to like ODHS for organizational delivery and health services, and that's all the health services research grants get reviewed together, regardless of what institute they're going to. So there'll be like an orthopedic surgery one, and an ED one, and then a cancer one, and a whatever, and they'll all get kind of scored against each other. And then,
despite the fact that they're funded by different institutes.
Yeah.
Which makes no sense to me, but.
So that's how it goes. So they get scored by the study section, and then there's a sort of nebulous process that varies by institute that Amber was referring to, where the program officer has some discretionary power to look at those scores, and then they decide what is moving forward in conjunction with something called council, which happens at the institute level, where the institute can look at those scores and say, we're going to just take the top 10 grants that were scored, or we're going to take the grants that are in accordance with our priorities, or we're going to take the ones that are blue, or like it's totally unclear like how they make those decisions, but they pick some number of grants to move forward with at that point, and then you get funded by the institute.
Yeah, so basically the study section, that review is independent. It has nothing to do with priorities. It's a pure scientific review. It's blinded, and then that score goes back to the institute for decisions. And that's where on institutes like NIDA and NIMH that don't use pay lines, where, if you get a clearly fundable score, if you're getting like in the teens or the early 20s, you'll probably get funded. But if you're getting somewhere closer to 30, right, that's about the threshold.
Lower scores are better.
Yeah, so lower scores are better. So like plus minus 30, I would say
best
anywhere like
possible
27 to 33, you may actually get funded over another app depending like how, like fitting their priorities at the time and stuff. And ARC really does this because their funding like sucks so bad that it's like, they really have to figure out like within a fundable range, who do they actually want to fund of all these good applications, and so.
Has anyone ever gotten a DoD grant?
I've not.
I've applied, didn't go well.
Wait, so when you
You
get
can
an
probably
R01, you're applying through a separate place, and then they're giving you a score and sending it back to your institution.
You're applying to, the whole process happens at the NIH. So you're applying to the NIH. The NIH sends it to the NIH Center for Scientific Review, which does this like study section review, and then they send it back to the other part of the NIH, which are the institutes. So it all happens within the NIH, it's just like two different sides of the NIH, the Center for Scientific Review and the separate institutes that ultimately determine the funding.
And the institute isn't the institute you're
It's not,
working at?
no, it's the National Cancer Institute,
Okay.
et cetera.
Heart, lung, and blood.
Heart, lung, and blood.
Yeah, institution is where you are,
I
right?
see.
Our institution, our academic institution. And you can even request, or and I would say you should request a specific study section. And you put this in a letter in the front and say, you know, I'd like this grant to be reviewed by such and such study section. And you should kind of try to find out, talking to POs, talking to other investigators, what do they like? You know, what do they know and what do they like? And you can actually go online and look at the roster of the study section, which is kind of the name and title and academic institution of every person on that roster. And you can see, oh, look, they're all cardiologists, or they're all nephrologists, or, I mean, I'm never that uniform, actually. It's a mix. So you got statistician, epidemiologist, you can see pediatrics, but you can kind of get a sense for what type of people are on the roster.
Emergency medicine is not well represented, though.
No.
In these study sections.
They usually do, I mean, they have ad hoc reviewers, so depending which applications they get, then they pluck us, like, right here, they pluck us to come sit on these sections because so-and-so, in fact, like, I remember I got plucked to try to review Lord Burke's, like, application, I'm like, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Right.
it's a
Slightly
conflict.
biased.
So, you know what I mean, like, these are they're trying to get you to review a very appropriate colleague application. But, Alex, do you guys have DoD funding? I mean, we could probably, I know
we
Nathan
have
is.
DoD funding. I haven't been the PI on any of those. I've reviewed a few of those grants. I'd be happy to talk with you afterward. I wouldn't claim to be an expert.
One of the weird things I found about the DoD grant was they have civilian reviewers, which I had not anticipated. Yeah. and
Civilian
so-
reviewers who don't have research backgrounds.
Correct, and it was the civilian reviewer who took great issue with my career development report and completely trashed it. So taking that experience going forward, I know what to do next time, so I'm looking forward to resubmitting.
This is also an interesting, so probably you should write your grant as least jargony as possible and as less technical as possible, because even if it's going to a very appropriate study section, they're probably not always content expertise in your area, right? Like, so ODHS is mine, and I found them to be really friendly, but again, because they're representing so many different specialties, they'll be very comfortable with the methods. Difference in difference health economic studies, that's fine, but like content, they might not totally get the importance of your topic. And so writing it more like you would write an article for the lay press as your introduction is actually a better strategy. So, I mean, I recently reviewed for EMF, and I remember this one, basic science. Like, I don't know the first thing about basic science, but she was able to communicate the importance of her basic science, you know, application to me, and it was easy to read. I didn't have to reread it multiple times. And I'm like, this is great. This is like a 1 or 2, you know? Because, like, again, if you can communicate such a complex project to me without me having to go back and be like, what are you trying to do? And like, what does that mean? And have to reread it multiple times, that's what you're seeking. So you're really writing for like simple sentences, avoid as much jargon as you can, put your main point, like just in an article, like how you would like be writing for the New York Times, and then you put your main point up front and then support it, right?
Yeah.
You don't like get to the point somewhere in the middle. And like those kind of strategies help you in writing grants.
They also don't have program officers for the DoD grants.
Mm.
I tried to reach out and they were like, this is classified information, you have to know it. And so it's a completely different experience. You get no feedback whatsoever when you submit the program.
Do you know other people who've submitted before and have been successful?
Yes. So my work was in Lyme arthritis, and the reason the civilian reviewer hated it was I said chronic Lyme doesn't exist.
And they had chronic
that
Lyme.
pissed off the civilian reviewer who wanted to study chronic Lyme. And so I learned some things.
Yeah, no, you got to be careful. It's
Yeah.
part of grantsmanship, as they say, and you know that's
Yeah.
probably a whole other workshop, right? I think there is actually a grant writing
whole
workshop
day.
here. So, yeah.
We'll be on Tuesday every year if you want to go to grant writing workshop.
But I mean, I think it's a really important issue for any grant, including R01s, because you're writing to such a mixed audience. You know, it's really hard. You may have one reviewer who's like an emergency physician who kind of does correlating work, and that one reviewer is going to be like, this is awesome, and then everybody else you got to convince. So.
And what she means by convince is it's a whole room of other people that you have to convince, and they also score that grant based on the 2 to 3 people who are the primary and secondary and tertiary reviewers. so those people are trying to persuade everybody else what this grant is like. Either they scored well or scores badly.
And so there's clearly an element of luck, right? Because if your primary reviewer really likes your idea, or he or she, that they will advocate for you, for your grant to the whole study section, and then everyone will kind of give you a better score. Whereas if they're having a bad day, you irritated them with some comment in the grant, and they just say, no, this is bad, and they find all the weaknesses and talk about the weaknesses, then everyone's going to give you a bad score.
And I think it's really important to say, so I've always found the study sections that I needed to go to be very clear, but I've definitely seen some colleagues' applications torpedoed because it went to the wrong study section. And some institutes, it's like hard to find like which is the right one of these, what sound like overlapping kind of interests. But I think it's really important because I think another example of this is sometimes that I just recently sat on a special emphasis panel, which was like an overflow panel, and they pulled from these different sections. And I felt like that was a weird panel because again, everybody ended up with like a score of 4. I feel like there was no different. And I just feel like it wasn't as synergistic as you would usually see on a panel that's used to seeing like a certain type of application come through. I've also sat on a special emphasis panel for NHLBI that I remember had like really heterogeneous stuff. It was like on secondary data. So there were like genomic studies being evaluated with like services and economics research. And I just saw some people like completely torpedo applications. Like I think there was too much variability on like what was being reviewed in that. So it's really interesting, and you probably don't have much control if you're going to go to a special emphasis panel, and some of the RFAs, like the specific RFAs,
They just automatically go there, so you don't have a lot of choice about it.
but if it's a really tight idea where all the applications are going to be around the concept, it's probably okay. But certain things like novel uses of secondary data analysis, which could be like pulling clinical trial data, pulling genomics databases, pulling health services, like that is you got to consider that because I found that these like heterogeneous panels don't get as good of reviews.
Is that an R21 mechanism, the NHLBIs?
It was an R21,
okay.
yeah.
Thinking about submitting one, so maybe we'll talk.
Inside scoop.
Yeah, as you can tell, it's all about talking to people because everyone knows a little bit of inside information about NIH. And again, you don't find it on the websites. Sometimes people don't want to email this stuff, so you got to get on the phone. So as Maggie said, if there's anything you take away from this session is early and frequent contact with your POs to get a sense of, should you proceed and where to kind of navigate the grant.
And sometimes you have to talk to like 2 or 3 POs to figure out who's like the right person for you, right? Like, my work is in health services research, but it's also in equity, and we also study children, and so like there's a bunch of different places where it could potentially have landed. And so it actually took us like a couple different chats with POs to figure out like not only which institute, but also sort of which person was ultimately going to champion this forward and was most excited about it. And the first couple chats were kind of dispiriting, and then you get someone who's like sort of gets it, and you're like, oh, you're my person, thank you.
Maggie, that sort of brings us to one of our questions we're going to talk about is how did you have broad interest in certain things. How did you land on the questions that then stuck? How did you figure that out?
There's a lot of unfunded grants on the list of things that didn't make it, right? I think it's also about thinking about sort of what is R01 scopable, right? And so, we had this like larger scale question about quality and equity of care for children receiving care in general emergency department, and there just wasn't going to really be any way to answer that question on a foundation grant or an R21. Like it was too big to do in any other way. And so we had actually written it as a HRSA grant originally, and then it was not funded, and we were sort of like sitting on this like large scale grant proposal, and so it wasn't that hard to like reformat it into an R01 once we figured out who was the right PO to send it to. But I think it's a matter of thinking about like which are the questions that are most interesting to you, and then what is the scale of resources that it's going to take to answer those questions in a way that's meaningful.
I think so. Yeah, there's a lot to be said though. You can't just be like, this is the idea that I have, and I'm going for this exact idea. You also have to adapt. Like it's really hard for emergency medicine because we are a generalist specialty. It's maybe a little easier if you have like a clear one condition that you study that fits really well in that disease model. Very difficult for some of us that want to study like delivery or systems or something. So I definitely say, well, I have this general idea and then I tailor the aims to fit what the institute actually wants to within, because once you get funded, you can do that like spin-off project. You can answer that question you want within this scope. But there's a lot of grants which, if like, what should I actually propose to them as like the scope of work that I'm going to be doing for this grant, and then I'll do that other stuff that I really want to do under that umbrella when I get it.
We did that for the
Yeah.
UG3, UH3, so I study like interventions to address social determinants of health in the PD, and the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research came out with a like call for proposals looking for social determinants of health interventions in dentistry. And I was like, well, oral health in the ED is a big problem, right? Like, people show up a lot with unmet dental needs, so we could study like social determinants of health in patients with unmet dental needs. And that was like our grant, and now we're doing this like large-scale clinical trial of social needs screening in patients with unmet dental needs across 3 sites, right? And we like partnered with our dentists. And ultimately, like teeth turned out to be kind of a good model system, but it was purely Amber's point about like that was where the money was, and so we picked, sort of like zebrafish versus some other model system, right? That just is the model system that we're studying the thing that we care about in, and it happens to be teeth.
That, I think you sort of answered it too, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about rejection, and I think everybody could probably talk a little bit about rejection, hopefully.
Yeah, actually, I've kind of had a bit of a transition recently. So my prior philosophy was focus all your energy on one grant and make it perfect and make sure it gets funded. And that worked for a little bit for me. And then I was actually on a panel with some other researchers and listening, kind of similar to this, and they were telling the audience about their strategy, which was totally different than mine. They were submitting lots of grants to lots of different places and kind of playing the numbers game a little bit. And with that, obviously, comes rejection. And I've actually now adopted that model where I'm actually going to be submitting more grants to more different places and with greater frequency, knowing that a lot of them are not going to hit and I'm going to get rejected. And as I mentioned earlier, I submitted this R34 in October, did not get a great score, and I'm emotionally fine with it, actually. Yeah. And I got 3 other grants rejected this year, small internal grants. And again, emotionally fine with it. It's part of the game. For me, it's the baseball analogy. I don't know if anyone watches baseball, but an all-star hitter hits 30% of the time. 70% of the time they strike out or they, whatever, they don't get on base. But if you can get 30% of your grants funded, you're an all-star, right? Just so think of it as like a baseball game.
I actually had a question kind of related, because you had mentioned something about some specific phrase, a return on investment.
Right.
Like, can you talk about what that means more in terms of a grant, like a review from an institute's eyes? I know we talked about their specific aims and what they're looking for, but what does that mean?
Well, for one, they want to make sure that you do the study, right? If you say, I'm going to enroll 1,000 syncope patients, they want to make sure that you enroll that many syncope patients. And then, so I can actually give you an example. So right now in my R01, I was far behind in enrollment for a couple reasons. We were slow to get off the ground because of COVID. Then I changed institutions, so we actually had to pause enrollment for about 6 months. And so my PO started to ask me, hey, how's enrollment going? And I said, we're doing all right, but we're a little behind because of X, Y, and Z. She says, okay, we're going to put you on a milestone accrual plan, which means that every quarter you're going to tell me exactly how many patients you've enrolled. And we're going to map it out for the next 3 years and make sure you can get to your 1,000. So they want to make sure that you're going to do the study. So that's because if you don't, then that's a total loss of money for them, right? If I just shrug my shoulders, I only get to 200 and I can't really publish, they just wasted $5 million. They lost their entire investment. So they've actually changed I think they're evolving in terms of the level of accountability that there is for R01s. It used to be, and this is kind of before our time, but it used to be, here's the money, do your best. And now it's, check in with us every month or every quarter and tell us exactly how far you're going. So that's how they make sure they get their return on investment. And then obviously they want you to publish things that will have impact in your field, that will move the research field forward, that will change clinical practice, and improve the health of Americans in whatever way that institute is focused on. But I think ultimately that's what they want. But I'm sure you guys have additional comments about return on investment.
That's
Sure.
I found it's like, since I don't recruit patients in my research, my work is all health economics and retrospective kind of work, that there's a little bit more flexibility. You like propose certain names, and then once you get into it, like perhaps the original questions kind of veer in a little bit of a different direction and stuff. And so I've definitely noticed that on services grants, that there's a little bit of flexibility. I mean, we've still, this one, we've met our aims, but we've also kind of veered from one of the aims. It didn't make sense to do anymore. And so, whereas I feel like a lot of clinical trials, well, you often have to like recruit before you can set, and so like, you just got to do it. Whereas, yeah, in services you
registered it, right? So
yeah,
you're like
yeah,
committed to the
yeah,
thing you said you're going to do.
Yeah. And I think that that's also why you need those pilot studies and stuff first, and the feasibility, whereas like services research is very open. There's lots of questions you can answer, and endless amount of questions you can answer with the data, basically.
Part of the reason they want the ROI is they want the public to know that taxpayers are spending this money for good reason. And like when COVID hit, there were a lot of citizens who didn't know what NIH did and how it was funding everything, right? So they want to make sure that money is being well used.
And they have to go back and argue for their own internal budgets, for their sections, and for their institutes. And so being able to say, like, we funded Marc and his trial changed clinical practice, and therefore our section is like doing great work, and we should have more money for like work like this in the future. Like, it actually helps them also. So it is about like the health of the public for sure, and they want to be like, your success is their success, right?
I think we started touching on this, but I feel like there's more to say about the rejection issue, not so much the emotional, but like what you do, both the logistics of the first rejection and then the logistics of, like, I think you were saying, maybe this is a good idea and I need to pivot a little bit and use it somewhere else. What have people done with rejections in terms of both resubmissions and other things, or no?
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
The summary statement that you get with the rejection, when you address the issues, it kind of has to be, I heard, a page long.
One page, yeah.
So I guess that goes into whether you can resubmit, like if there's too many things.
Oh no, you can fit any number of things on one page.
So you can always address that.
There's a strategy.
And then but though, is there like a number for each section that you might say, I need to scrap it, and I know you're gonna rework it, but when, how do you determine whether or not you should resubmit versus submit new, totally different?
The first decision node is, did it get triaged or not? So
Let's
if you
say
got a
no.
score, that already means you're in the top 50%.
Right.
And most people would resubmit
Okay.
that if they had a score and try to address the issues. Unless you're feeling like the whole time this is like a square peg in a round hole thing.
You can also talk to
Yeah,
the-
again,
yeah.
talk to your
Yeah.
PO about it, totally.
And triage, I mean, my first K was triage, my second K was funded. And I think a lot of times for your first K, they just want to give you feedback and make you change things. And so it's a summary statement. You look at the summary statement. Is it something? Are they fixable issues? I think I would scrap it if they really don't think it's important. If you cannot convince them that your thing is important, no fixing the approach is going to make them want to fund it if it's not important. So that might be a scrappable thing, but.
Yeah, you have to really think. So I remember when my K was scored really well, but not funded by ARC, and then I had to think, can I adapt this into, it was studying observation units in the ED, and so I was like, can I adapt that to chest pain? And I started to like flesh out what this like concept would look like in a certain population of patients, and I'm like, this impact just went way down for me. Like if I was reviewing this, like this is less impactful now, and I just lost interest and scrapped the idea. But I think it's important also to not, it's important to not necessarily have your eggs in all in one basket
Yeah.
either. Like have a couple areas of like promising lines of research. I do think that there's, you know, if you have a good idea, there's something about taking that idea and like iterating it through, and a lot of successful people have been trying to get their one idea funded for many years before they're successful, like 3 years, 4 years oftentimes. And so it's important not to scrap a good idea if you believe in it, but it's like hard to know, like partly talking to people, what's in the literature, like how much buzz around your, in the end, like I think you can get a sense like, is this research question important, and is it just that the aims that I wrote, is it grantsmanship, you know, like is there a way to articulate the aims to get at the question so that it sounds more impactful? Because yeah, I think that's a really important thing too. You could have a stellar application and methods and everything, it could be like, but then if you have, you know, like the question's not going to impact that many people. You could get like very high scores throughout and then still get a mediocre. So what'll happen is you'll be in that like 4. The 4 is unfundable at NIH, unfortunately, in many, you know, it just won't get you down to the percentile you need a lot of times. And so it's like a good application, like they liked it. It's just you're competing against all these other good applications.
Right.
And that's what happens to like most, I feel like. Very few are bad that are coming through.
And I would say, if you got a score, just to reiterate what Amber said, if you got a score and you got the summary statement, and it seems most of the, not everything, but most of the things are fixable or addressable, I would say yes, resubmit, because it's very rare to get funded on the first shot.
Yeah.
So you should go into the process thinking, I'm going to submit, I'm going to get feedback, and then I'll resubmit.
And you're going back to the same study section?
Yeah.
But
Typically.
it will
the
have
same reviewers.
sometimes the same reviewers, but sometimes different reviewers. So when, there's an art to the resubmitting, right? Because you want to be responsive to what they said in the first review, but be careful not to change it in any ways they're going to piss off any new reviewers, right? So you want to be like, that's a very fine line to walk, because particularly if you had an ad hoc reviewer on the first time, which you won't know, right? Because it's all anonymous, you could easily get sent to different reviewers the second time, and they might find different problems. They will have access to that first summary statement and to your response, so they'll be able to evaluate if you were responsive to the first review, and they're in fact asked to evaluate that, but they may decide that they have something else that they don't like about your grant, and that is always a risk.
And a little discouraging thing is that there is not a lot of reliability in the peer review process. Unfortunately, there is some luck to it. I mean, of course, there's like some good grantsmanship, but again, like distinguishing between a bunch of good and applications is often hard. And they've done studies on very well scoring applications that go back to a different set of reviewers, and there's just no reliability in the scores. And so it's just the nature of the game. So that doesn't mean, like if you get a good score and it doesn't get funded, it doesn't mean the idea is bad, and you just keep iterating it and sending it back to different maybe study sections, or even the same one with like a new application with slightly different retooled. I would say though, hopefully if the reviewers are doing their job, they have read your first page, you know, response, and they take that into consideration, like, so they're already coming from the lens of like what the previous critiques were, rather than trying to poke new holes in it and saying like, did this application respond? And so if they can still poke holes and torpedo it, but like hopefully you don't get that reviewer, and then they're reviewing it with the lens of like the previous submission. That will help you then in that case than a new submission, which was truly up in the air to like find new critiques. So
How many times can you resubmit?
once, if it's technically the same, otherwise it becomes a new application. But you can,
And then you
can
submit it as a new application.
Yeah, you can submit it again as a new application.
It's different than it was 10, 15 years ago.
But this timeline about the resubmission is the answer to your question about why do you have to submit the R immediately after getting the K, right? Is because if each submission cycle takes 9 months, and you know you're going to need 2 of them, and then in between you're going to need 6 months to like revise, then you're talking about like 2 years of the R process out of your 4 or 5 year K. And so at least at the halfway mark, you want to be like ideally going in with the initial submission. Almost no one actually makes that deadline, right? Because it's very close to impossible. And so, you know, it's nice, but it is very hard to actually do.
All right, we have 1 or 2 minutes left.
Do you guys have any other questions?
Oh, yeah. Do you want
When you said 18 publications before your first R01 or first K, I forget, was that first author on all of them?
Most of them. Yeah, so I mean, yes, I had fewer publications. I was at well, I'm not a fast writer. either. So I won't be doing Mark's strategy of like just throwing out a bunch of stuff. Like I am more meticulous and submit, you know, like what I think will be scored. Like I've never had an application triaged, and so, but again, I also write a lot less. And so I'm also not a very fast writer for publishing, and I'm not at an institution that's like super resource where there's big groups like putting each other on publications. But it didn't matter. Like I even when I went up for promotion this year, like 70% of my papers are first or last author, like more than half are first author, and then I have some like respectable journals in there. And so I think that combination with like a good senior team and a couple of us that had worked together and were able to demonstrate that with some publications was what was needed. So there's different pathways. I think again, the key takeaway is that yes, you're the PI, but truly in a project grant, they're more, and this actually gets back to, like I've been having a lot of discussions with people who are interested in going for a K, like NIA. So if you go for a K at the NIA, when they review your application, they're like, we want to build a geriatric researcher, right? Like, so suddenly that changes. You know, you want to do a Medicare study, you can't just do a Medicare study. You really want to, and you have to want to impact care for the geriatric population. But if you're doing a research project grant, I may pivot and not be a geriatric researcher, but I could be answering a question that is like a single question that's of interest to that institution right now, and that's okay. So there's like a difference in research project grants that we have brought together a team to answer this discrete question that is timely right now. And yeah.
And maybe we should talk about ESI.
Yes, but we only have 1 minute left, so
Okay.
you're welcome to talk about ESI, and then people can ask questions individually.
Early stage investigator is a status that you all have for 10 years, starting after your terminal degree. So if you finished residency in 2012, then you're ESI until 2022. And this gives you a kind of a bonus or a bump in your score just for being an early stage investigator, which can sometimes be the difference between being kind of on the cusp and getting funded. So you want to be aware of this 10-year clock, and not to put additional pressure, but you know, you really want to use that ESI because it's going to help you.
If you did a master's or graduate degree, you can reset your clock to end at the end of your terminal degree, not necessarily your residency. And if you had a baby or child care responsibilities or any family care responsibilities, NIH will also kick out the clock. So lots of opportunities for clock extension if need be. And many of my colleagues have done that really successfully. And you also get a bump for being a new investigator. So even if you've missed the ESI clock, you can still get a bump for being new.
Yes, if you get it, so for like me, I went back and got a master's after I was faculty. So I graduated med school and residency a long time ago, but I got my master's in 2017. So that's very helpful. And which also answers your question, is should you get a master's if you're taking a bunch of master's classes, you should get a master's.
Because you can reset the clock, and that's like very helpful.
It also depends on the institute, though.
Yeah,
They reset the clock.
Yeah, I've heard
Institute.
some institutes don't consider the master's as like a terminal degree.
Everything I've talked to has said pretty clearly that counts. Because it was a research degree, it's my master's.
You do get 1 year per kid, though.
Yeah.
That one is definitely true.
Full year.
It's a full year.
One thing we didn't get to, but I think it's really important to say, is a lot of people remember like, oh, I'm not ready for the R01, so I'm going to go for an R21 or an R03.
Oh, yeah.
And it takes just as much time. I mean, it's a slightly smaller application, but truly most of the R is the thinking about and the preliminary work before you even put pen to paper, you know, like what you did before, like what your ideas are, talking to people, bouncing the specific off. So all that doesn't change. It's almost as much work to submit that grant and actually lower funding lines. There's more people going for R21. Maybe R03. R03 is so small, but you know, so you really have to think like, is that the right strategy? If you could maybe take whatever your R21 or R03 idea and wrap that up into aim one of your R01. And that's what my mentor encouraged me to do, and I'm very glad he did, and it panned out. But in the study sections I've sat in, there's a lot more. There's a lot of R21s, and they fund oftentimes at the 7th percentile. So,
I think we're going to have one last question.
Is there any reason why you can't submit multiple if you're going for a bigger and a smaller grant? Is there a penalty for submitting?
You can't submit the same science,
Okay.
right? Like, because the R21s and the R01s are getting reviewed by the same study section, and they're gonna be like really mixed if they're looking at your grant twice in two different formats. You can to like EMF and SAEMF, but like the foundations don't really care about that. But my position is that NIH is pretty annoyed about that. So just try and make them distinct.
Yeah. And anytime you do submit overlapping applications, you have to note it on your other support. So if you're, you know what I mean? So you want to try to make the A's a little bit distinct.
Try not to.
But I think that's a really important point. The R21s and R01s are actually reviewed. So if you're submitting in the same cycle, that's actually not a good idea.
This was extremely helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we've emailed, right? With Ben's work. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
You're still at OHSU. That's terrific.
We know what happens with doing on the
No way.
Thursday.
She's a rock star, right?
I took
So
over
good.
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember
that was like my
Yeah,
first
yeah.
project I helped with after.
I'm gonna grab my bag and check out.
Okay, I gotta go check out. They need to
Yeah.
Ben speaks very highly of her.
I got. Bye, Mike.
Take care. Thanks, Amber. Great. And so what are your plans for long term? Middle school? Awesome. That's terrific. I'm sure you'll have a very strong reputation, especially if you have all the research stuff. Are you on a lot of abstracts that are coming out here?
Yeah, we're on all these abstracts.
Terrific. We need to do that more on the show.
Yeah, it's so great that you have so many of your people
We
here.
have a lot of students.
It's great.
Yeah, yeah, we're putting their names, like all women. And we awesome, amazing.
Lori, maybe next year you can give a didactic on how to effectively work with the undergrads and both mentor them, but also get work out of them. It's very challenging.
I mean, it's been really impressive that they actually got national talks.
Yeah.
We had a little issue. Probably have something. Overall, yeah.
How to get work out. Well, it's the balance between putting time in and getting work out, and then, you know, how long do you guys commit to her lab? Is it 6 months? 1 semester? Is it a year? 2 years. 2 years. So I think that's helpful. Ours is only 2 semesters.
You're in the right place.
And then there's always a creep of that 2 semesters. Well, actually, it's only a semester and a half. And then for 2 years, how much time?
It's
technically 10 hours, but yeah.
And in the summer, it's 30 though.
It's
Yeah.
30.
So I think that's good. So
Yeah.
ours was
It's
8 hours, but there's a drive.
I'm just,
Yeah,
I'm thinking we may end up presenting it to ourselves.
Yep, I'm thinking that might.
That's why my
Do you guys get credit for it, or is it totally?
You can through an ISO honors program or whatever, but no,
I
not
think
through
it
the
starts with.
scholars, through the NIH
It's
program.
funded though too.
Oh,
through
so you guys fund it.
Yeah, they're funded.